A quiet Sunday morning in an exclusive Maryland suburb shatters when an aggressive police officer spots a black man simply checking his mail. Assuming the worst, the officer ignores every warning sign, slaps on the cuffs, and drags his target to the precinct, hungry for a major bust. But he didn't arrest a burglar. He arrested the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. By sunset, the local station will be surrounded by heavily armed federal agents. Karma rarely hits this hard. The morning sun hung low over the manicured lawns of Bethesda, Maryland, casting long, peaceful shadows across the affluent neighborhood of Elmwood Estates. It was the kind of neighborhood where the silence was only broken by the soft, rhythmic ticking of underground sprinkler systems and the occasional hum of a luxury sedan. Arthur Pendleton cherished these rare Sunday mornings. As the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, his life was a relentless storm of national security briefings, congressional hearings, and crisis management. But on Sundays, before his secure phone inevitably started buzzing, he was just a homeowner tending to his hydrangeas. Arthur was dressed for comfort, wearing faded grey sweatpants, worn-out sneakers, and a vintage Georgetown University sweatshirt that had seen better decades. At 58, he still carried the broad-shouldered, imposing physique of his early days as a field agent, though his hair had completely turned to distinguished silver. He held a green garden hose, letting the cool water soak into the soil of his prize-winning flower beds, utterly at peace. 2 blocks down the winding suburban street, a local police cruiser was crawling along the asphalt. Behind the wheel was Officer Derek Rollins. Rollins was a man whose ambition vastly outpaced his actual law enforcement capabilities. In his late 20s, he had a reputation in the precinct for being overly aggressive, constantly fishing for a high-profile collar that would fast-track him to detective. Riding shotgun was his partner, Officer Greg Miller, a quieter, older man who usually just kept his head down and waited for his pension to vest. "Look at this place," Rollins muttered, tapping his fingers against the steering wheel as they cruised past sprawling stone mansions. "People out here have more money than they know what to do with. Makes them easy targets." "Crime rate here is practically zero, Derek," Miller replied softly, taking a sip from his insulated coffee mug. "Only thing we ever get called out here for is a noise complaint about a pool pump." "Yeah, well, you still got to keep your eyes peeled. Complacency gets you killed," Rollins recited, though the dramatic sentiment hardly fit the serene suburban setting. As the cruiser rounded the bend, Rollins narrowed his eyes. He spotted a figure at the end of a long, paved driveway. It was Arthur, standing by the flower beds in his baggy sweats, reaching into the oversized brick mailbox. Rollins tapped the brakes. The cruiser slowed to a crawl. He looked at Arthur, a tall black man in old clothes, standing in front of a $6 million property. The gears in Rollins's biased, eager mind began to turn. "What do we have here?" Rollins murmured, pulling the cruiser toward the curb and putting it in park. Miller sighed, looking up from his coffee. "Derek, leave it alone. The guy is just getting the paper." "In those clothes? At the Pendleton residence?" Rollins scoffed. He knew the house belonged to someone important, though he hadn't bothered to learn the face of the man who owned it. "He looks like a drifter casing the joint, or maybe a disgruntled landscaper. I'm going to check it out." Before Miller could protest further, Rollins was out of the cruiser, his hand resting instinctively on his utility belt. He adjusted his sunglasses and strutted up the driveway, his boots crunching loudly against the pristine concrete. Arthur heard the heavy footsteps and turned, shutting the mailbox door. He held the thick Sunday paper under his arm. He offered a polite, neighborly nod, completely unbothered by the police presence. "Good morning, officer." "Step away from the mailbox," Rollins commanded, his voice sharp, lacking any basic courtesy. Arthur raised a silver eyebrow, his polite smile fading into a look of calm, calculated assessment. Over his 30-year career in federal law enforcement, he had encountered every type of human behavior. He instantly recognized the puffed-out chest and the aggressive posture. It was the universal body language of an insecure cop looking for a confrontation. "I live here," Arthur said simply, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that naturally commanded a room. "I'm just getting my paper." I said, "Step away from the box, and keep your hands where I can see them," Rollins barked, stepping closer. "Do you have any identification on you?" "I don't carry my wallet when I step out to water my lawn," Arthur replied, his tone remaining perfectly level. "My ID is inside the house. If you give me a moment, I can go retrieve it." "You aren't going anywhere," Rollins snapped, closing the distance between them. "Whose house is this? What's the homeowner's name?" Arthur sighed quietly. "The homeowner's name is Arthur Pendleton, as I just told you. That is me." Rollins let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. "Right. Sure it is. You own this place? A guy dressed like you? I know people who live in this neighborhood, pal. You don't fit the profile." "The profile?" Arthur repeated. The word hung in the humid morning air. Arthur's eyes turned cold, though his posture remained entirely relaxed. "Officer, I highly suggest you reconsider this line of inquiry. You are making an assumption based on a profound lack of information. Check my license plates on the SUV in the garage. Call your dispatcher." "Don't tell me how to do my job," Rollins growled, offended that a suspect was giving him orders. He reached out and grabbed Arthur's right arm, twisting it forcefully behind Arthur's back. Arthur's muscles tensed instinctively, but his disciplined mind overrode his reflexes. He knew better than to physically resist a local patrolman, especially an erratic one. He let his arm be pulled behind him, dropping the Sunday paper onto the driveway. Officer Miller jogged up the driveway looking panicked. "Derek! Hey, let's take a second here. He's not fighting you." "He's refusing to identify himself and trespassing on private property," Rollins stated, pulling his handcuffs from his belt. The heavy metal clicked loudly as he locked them tight around Arthur's thick wrists. Too tight. Arthur stood perfectly still, his hands bound behind his back. He looked directly into Rollins's eyes, his expression completely devoid of fear. "Officer," Arthur said softly, his voice carrying the chilling weight of absolute authority. "I will not resist you, but I am going to tell you exactly once. You are making a catastrophic mistake. Take these cuffs off now, and we can pretend this never happened." Rollins smirked, shoving Arthur toward the cruiser. "Save it for the judge, buddy. You're under arrest." The back seat of the Bethesda local police cruiser was constructed of hard, molded plastic, designed for easy cleaning rather than comfort. Arthur sat rigidly, his broad shoulders forced forward by the tight metal bracelets biting into his wrists. The interior of the car smelled faintly of stale fast food and cheap industrial disinfectant. Through the plexiglass divider, he stared at the back of Officer Rollins's head, analyzing the situation with the icy detachment that had made him a legendary federal investigator. He wasn't angry. Anger was a useless emotion in a crisis. Instead, Arthur felt a profound, almost clinical sense of disappointment. He had dedicated his life to reforming law enforcement, to elevating the standards of policing across the nation. Yet, here he was, detained by an arrogant rookie acting entirely on unchecked prejudice. Arthur mentally logged every procedural violation Rollins had committed. No probable cause, no reading of Miranda rights, excessive use of force, and a complete failure to verify identity before detention. In the driver's seat, Rollins was practically glowing with self-satisfaction. He tapped the steering wheel to the rhythm of the radio, occasionally glancing in the rearview mirror to check on his prisoner. "See, Miller?" Rollins boasted, speaking loudly enough for Arthur to hear. "This is how you keep a neighborhood clean. Proactive policing. Guy couldn't even keep his story straight. Said he lived there, but couldn't produce an ID classic burglar casing the joint, probably waiting for the real owners to leave for church." Miller, sitting in the passenger seat, looked physically ill. He kept stealing glances at Arthur in the mirror. There was something deeply unsettling about the man in the back seat. Criminals usually protested. They yelled, they cried, they made threats, or they tried to bargain. This man was entirely silent, sitting with a posture so straight and composed it felt like he was the one in charge of the vehicle. "Derek," Miller whispered, leaning toward his partner. "Did you even run the address? Did you call it in?" "I don't need to call it in. I caught him red-handed trespassing," Rollins dismissed, taking a hard right turn that sent Arthur sliding slightly across the plastic bench. "Sergeant O'Malley is going to love this. We've had that string of package thefts on the east side. I bet you anything this is our guy." Arthur remained silent. He closed his eyes, already calculating his next moves. He needed to contact his inner circle. Specifically, he needed to reach Thomas Hayes, the deputy director of the FBI. Arthur knew that if he revealed his identity right now, Rollins might panic and attempt to cover his tracks, perhaps even escalating the violence out of fear. It was tactically safer to let the process play out until he was in a secure, recorded environment. 10 minutes later, the cruiser pulled into the gated rear lot of the local precinct. It was a sturdy, brutalist brick building that had stood since the late 70s. Rollins parked the car, stepped out, and opened the rear door, grabbing Arthur roughly by the bicep. "Out!" Rollins barked. Arthur stepped out into the bright mid-morning sun, finding his footing gracefully despite having his hands bound. He towered over Rollins by 3 inches, a physical fact that clearly irritated the younger officer. Rollins pushed Arthur toward the heavy steel doors of the precinct's rear entrance. The booking area was a flurry of low-level Sunday morning activity. A few officers were typing at their desks, drinking coffee, and complaining about the upcoming shift changes. Fluorescent lights buzzed harshly overhead. At the elevated booking desk sat Sergeant O'Malley, a red-faced veteran with a thick mustache and tired eyes. "Look what the cat dragged in," Rollins announced loudly, shoving Arthur toward the booking desk. "Caught him creeping around Elmwood Estates. Refused to identify himself. Trespassing. Resisting. The works." O'Malley looked down from his perch, chewing slowly on a piece of gum. He looked at Arthur's calm, impassive face, the grey sweatpants, the Georgetown hoodie. "No ID?" O'Malley asked, his voice gravelly. "Claimed it was inside the house," Rollins sneered. "Claimed he owned the place. $6 million estate, Sarge. Guy must think we're idiots." "Empty your pockets," O'Malley instructed, looking at Arthur. "My hands are cuffed behind my back, Sergeant," Arthur replied evenly. His voice cut through the background noise of the station. Several officers looked up from their keyboards. There was an undeniable cadence of command in Arthur's tone. O'Malley frowned, noticing the tight cuffs. "Rollins, take the bracelets off. Empty his pockets." Rollins hesitated, then begrudgingly unlocked the cuffs. Arthur brought his arms forward, rubbing his raw wrists deliberately, ensuring the red welts were visible to the desk cameras. He reached into his sweatpants pockets and placed a single brass house key on the counter. Nothing else. "No wallet, no phone," Rollins noted triumphantly. "See? Who walks around with no phone?" "A man watering his own garden on a Sunday morning," Arthur stated clearly, looking directly into O'Malley's eyes. "Sergeant, your officer assaulted me on my own property. I am respectfully requesting my guaranteed phone call, and I suggest you preserve the dashcam footage from Officer Rollins's vehicle immediately." O'Malley stopped chewing his gum. A cold prickle of unease started to crawl up the back of his neck. The man standing before him was entirely too calm. He used words like preserve dashcam footage with the casual fluency of a seasoned prosecutor. Rollins scoffed loudly. Listen to this guy. Thinks he's a lawyer now. Go ahead, make your call. Call your public defender. Maybe they can explain to you how breaking and entering works. Give him the phone, Derek, O'Malley ordered softly, his eyes never leaving Arthur. Rollins shoved a heavy desk phone across the counter toward Arthur. Dial 9 for an outside line. Arthur picked up the receiver with a steady hand. He didn't need to look up a number. He had the direct, encrypted cell phone line of the Deputy Director of the FBI memorized. He dialed the 12 digits smoothly. The phone rang twice before a sharp, alert voice answered. Hayes, the voice on the other end said. Tom, Arthur said calmly, turning his back slightly to the desk. It's Arthur. There was a fraction of a second of silence on the line before the Deputy Director's tone shifted entirely. Sir, you're on an unsecure line. Is everything all right? No, Tom, I'm currently at the local police precinct in Bethesda. I have been arrested. Excuse me? Arrested? Hayes's voice dropped an octave, the tension radiating through the earpiece. Are you injured? I am physically fine, Arthur said, his eyes scanning the precinct, taking in the faces of Rollins, Miller, and O'Malley. I was detained outside my home. Unlawful detainment, excessive force. No Miranda. I need you to assemble the regional quick response team. Come to the Bethesda station. Bring legal counsel. Bring internal affairs and Tom? Yes, Director? Bring everyone, Arthur said softly. He hung up the phone and pushed it back across the desk. He looked at Rollins, offering a very small, utterly chilling smile. He's on his way. The air inside Bethesda Precinct Holding Cell Number 2 was stagnant, smelling of cheap bleach and years of human desperation. Officer Derek Rollins unceremoniously shoved Arthur into the small, concrete-walled enclosure. The metal bars slammed shut with a harsh, echoing clang that reverberated through the quiet Sunday morning station. Rollins turned the heavy key, locking the mechanism with a satisfied grunt. "Make yourself comfortable, pal," Rollins sneered, hooking his thumbs into his utility belt. "Your buddy is going to need a lot of cash to bond you out of this one. Burglary tools, resisting arrest, trespassing, failure to identify." Arthur stood in the center of the cell, looking around the dismal space before turning his gaze back to the arrogant rookie. He didn't bother correcting the fabricated charge of burglary tools. He knew Rollins was desperately stacking charges to justify the bad arrest. "Officer Rollins," Arthur said, his voice dropping into a low, terrifyingly calm register. "Do you have a pension plan?" Rollins blinked, caught off guard by the question. "What?" "A retirement account. A 401k, a pension," Arthur clarified, taking a slow step toward the iron bars. He didn't raise his voice, but the sheer weight of his presence seemed to suck the oxygen out of the corridor. "Because I highly recommend you start looking into private sector employment. Though given the federal indictments you will be facing by sundown, finding a job with a felony conviction will be exceedingly difficult for you." "Are you threatening a police officer?" Rollins demanded, his face flushing red, though a tiny sliver of doubt finally began to gnaw at the edge of his ego. "I'm stating a simple, inevitable fact," Arthur replied, turning his back on Rollins and sitting gracefully on the hard metal bench. He folded his hands in his lap, looking straight ahead, effectively dismissing the officer from his existence. Furious, Rollins spat a curse under his breath and stormed back out to the main booking area. Out at the front desk, the atmosphere had drastically changed. Sergeant O'Malley was no longer chewing his gum. His face had drained of all color, leaving his ruddy complexion a sickly, chalky gray. His eyes were glued to the glowing screen of his desktop computer, his hand trembling slightly as it rested on the mouse. When Arthur had demanded his phone call, O'Malley's instincts as a 30-year veteran had screamed that something was terribly wrong. As soon as Rollins had marched the prisoner to the back, O'Malley had pulled up the county property tax database. He typed in the address Rollins had provided, 442 Elmwood Estates. The screen populated almost instantly. Owner, Arthur J. Pendleton. Status, paid in full. Assessed value, $6.2 million. O'Malley's breath hitched. He then opened the National Criminal Database, typing in the name to see if this Arthur Pendleton had a record. The moment he hit search, the screen flashed a bright yellow warning banner. Restricted file. Clearance level 9. Required. Contact Department of Justice secure line. A cold sweat broke out across O'Malley's forehead. He minimized the police database, opened a standard web browser, and typed Arthur Pendleton into the search bar. The first result was a .gov website. It was an official government biography. There, staring back at O'Malley from the screen, was a high-resolution portrait of the man currently sitting in cell number 2. The man was wearing a sharp navy suit, looking distinguished and authoritative. Beneath the portrait were 5 words that made O'Malley feel like he was having a massive heart attack. Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Sarge, Rollins called out, strutting back into the booking area. Guy in the back is delusional, making threats about federal indictments. I'm tagging a terroristic threats charge onto his sheet. O'Malley slowly looked up from his monitor. He looked at Rollins, then at Officer Greg Miller, who was quietly sipping his coffee by the water cooler. Derek, O'Malley whispered, his voice cracking violently. Derek, what have you done? What do you mean? Rollins asked, his arrogant smile faltering at the sight of his sergeant's absolute terror. I got a bad guy off the streets, just doing my job. You idiot, O'Malley breathed, standing up. His legs were shaking so badly he had to grip the edge of the desk to keep from collapsing. You absolute, catastrophic idiot. You didn't arrest a burglar. Before O'Malley could explain, 30 miles away in Washington, D.C., the machinery of the United States government was moving with terrifying speed. Deputy Director Thomas Hayes had slammed the phone down in his secure home office and immediately hit a red speed dial button on his encrypted console. He didn't call the local police chief. He didn't call the mayor. He called Special Agent in Charge Richard Caldwell, the commander of the FBI's Washington field office. Caldwell. Hayes barked the moment the line connected. The director has been unlawfully detained by local police in Bethesda. The arresting officers used physical force and ignored his identity. I want a full tactical rollout. Now. Sir? The director? Caldwell's voice sharpened instantly, shifting into combat mode. Hostage rescue team, mobilize the Regional Quick Response Force and the WFO SWAT element, Hayes ordered, already pulling a shoulder holster over his dress shirt. I don't know the state of mind of these local cops, but they are armed, they are erratic, and they have Arthur in a cage. We are treating this as an active, hostile hostage situation under federal jurisdiction. I want the station locked down. Nobody gets in. Nobody gets out until I have eyes on Arthur. Wheels up in 5 minutes, sir. We'll bring the storm, Caldwell promised. Back at the precinct, the quiet Sunday morning was ticking away. O'Malley frantically grabbed the phone, trying to call the chief of police, but his hands were shaking too badly to dial the numbers. Sarge, seriously, what is your problem? Rollins asked, stepping closer to the desk. You're acting like I shot the mayor. Worse, Derek, worse, O'Malley croaked, finally turning the monitor around so Rollins could see the screen. Look at the screen. Look at his face. Rollins leaned in, squinting at the government web page. He read the name. He read the title. The blood instantly vanished from his face. His jaw went slack, and the coffee he had just poured slipped from his fingers, shattering against the linoleum floor. No, Rollins whispered, stumbling backward. No, that's impossible. He was wearing sweatpants. He didn't look like what, Derek? Officer Miller suddenly shouted, tossing his own cup into the trash, realizing the horrifying implication of Rollins's profiling. He didn't look like he belonged in that neighborhood. I told you to leave him alone. I told you. We need to let him out. Rollins panicked, his bravado entirely evaporating. He lunged for his keys. I'll just let him out, apologize. Say it was a misunderstanding. It's too late for that, O'Malley said, staring blankly at the front doors of the precinct. A low, deep rumble began to vibrate through the floorboards of the station. It wasn't the high-pitched wail of police sirens. It was the heavy, synchronized roar of massive, armored diesel engines. The rumble grew to a deafening roar, shaking the framed commendations hanging on the precinct walls. Before Rollins or O'Malley could move toward the holding cells, the front windows of the Bethesda police station darkened as massive vehicles blocked out the morning sun. Officer Miller rushed to the reinforced glass and gasped, "Oh dear God." Outside, the quiet suburban street had been utterly transformed into a militarized zone. 8 black, unmarked Chevrolet Suburbans had screeched to a halt, forming a barricade that entirely boxed in the local police cruisers. Behind them, 2 massive armored Lenco Bearcats, painted matte tactical olive, idled aggressively, their heavy tires crushing the manicured curbs. The doors of the vehicles flew open simultaneously. Over 40 heavily armed federal agents poured out into the street. They moved with terrifying, silent precision. They wore full tactical armor, Kevlar helmets, and olive-drab windbreakers with FBI emblazoned across the back and chest in bold yellow lettering. They carried short-barreled M4 carbines, their weapons held at the low ready. "Perimeter secured. Roof access covered," a voice commanded over a bullhorn. Through the windows, Miller could see snipers taking positions on the roof of the dental clinic across the street, their long-range rifles pointed directly at the precinct doors. "They're surrounding the building," Miller stuttered, backing away from the window with his hands instinctively raised. "Rollins," O'Malley ordered, his voice suddenly hard and desperate. "Put your hands on the desk. Do not touch your weapon. If they think we are a threat, they will level this building." The heavy, double-glass doors of the precinct were violently yanked open. A dozen tactical agents flooded into the lobby, fanning out with practiced, lethal efficiency. They bypassed the metal detectors, immediately securing the exits, the hallways, and the armory door. "Federal agents, keep your hands where we can see them. Nobody move!" The lead SWAT operator bellowed, his rifle sweeping the room before locking onto Rollins. "Hands away from your belt. Do it now." Rollins was hyperventilating. He raised his hands high above his head, trembling uncontrollably as 2 agents rushed forward. They didn't ask politely. They grabbed Rollins, spun him around, and violently stripped his duty belt, his service weapon, and his badge, tossing them onto the floor. Through the corridor of heavily armed agents strode Deputy Director Thomas Hayes. He was out of breath, his suit jacket unbuttoned, his eyes burning with absolute fury. Flanking him was Special Agent in Charge Caldwell, looking ready to dismantle the station brick by brick. Hayes marched directly to the booking desk, slamming his hand down on the elevated counter, making O'Malley jump out of his skin. "I am Deputy Director Thomas Hayes of the Federal Bureau of Investigation," he announced, his voice echoing in the dead silent room. "You are holding Director Arthur Pendleton. If a single hair on his head has been harmed, I will personally see to it that everyone in this building is charged with federal kidnapping under Title 18. "Where is he?" "He's in holding cell 2, sir," O'Malley stammered, pointing a shaky finger down the hall. "He's completely unharmed. It was a terrible mistake." "Give me the keys," Caldwell interrupted, snatching the heavy keyring right out of O'Malley's trembling hand. Hayes and Caldwell, followed by a tight protective detail of 4 SWAT operators, marched down the narrow cinder block hallway. They reached cell number 2. Arthur was still sitting on the metal bench, exactly as he had been left. His hands were resting in his lap, his expression completely tranquil. He looked up as the cavalry arrived. Caldwell quickly unlocked the door, sliding the heavy metal bars open. "Director, are you injured?" "I am fine, Richard," Arthur said, standing up smoothly. He smoothed the wrinkles out of his faded Georgetown sweatshirt. He looked at Hayes. "Thank you for the prompt response, Tom." "Arthur, what happened?" Hayes asked, his fury softening into profound relief. We didn't know what we were walking into. What you walked into, Tom, is a textbook example of why our Civil Rights Division is currently backed up with systemic reform cases," Arthur replied coolly. He stepped out of the cell, the federal agents parting respectfully to let him pass. "Let's go clear this up." Arthur walked back down the hallway and entered the main booking area. The room was frozen. Federal agents held the perimeter. O'Malley and Miller stood behind the desk, pale and terrified. And in the center of the room, surrounded by SWAT operators, stood Derek Rollins. Stripped of his weapon, his badge, and his unearned authority, he looked like exactly what he was: a frightened, arrogant bully who had finally picked a fight with a mountain. Arthur walked slowly toward Rollins, his sneakers squeaking softly on the linoleum. The director of the FBI stopped 2 feet in front of the disgraced officer. Rollins couldn't look him in the eye. He stared at Arthur's chest, his breathing ragged. "Sir, Director, I didn't know." "You didn't know," Arthur repeated, his voice smooth, echoing with devastating finality. "That is the crux of the issue, Officer Rollins. You didn't know. You didn't know if I owned that home. You didn't know my name. You didn't bother to ask for verification, and you didn't bother to investigate before using force." Arthur took a step closer, forcing Rollins to finally look up into his cold, unwavering eyes. "You looked at a black man in a wealthy neighborhood, and your prejudice made your decisions for you," Arthur stated, his tone devoid of anger, but heavy with absolute judgment. "You thought you were above the law because you wore a badge. But let me make this abundantly clear to you." Arthur gestured to the heavily armed federal agents surrounding them, the armored vehicles outside, the crushing weight of the United States government that had descended upon this local station. "You do not own the law," Arthur whispered, leaning in slightly. "We do. And as of this exact second, your career in law enforcement is permanently over." Arthur turned to Hayes, his command absolute. "Tom, call the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. Have them send a federal investigative team down here. I want every arrest Officer Rollins has made over the last 5 years audited. I want this entire precinct reviewed for civil rights violations." "Yes, Director," Hayes nodded, pulling his phone from his pocket. Arthur looked at Rollins one last time. "You thought you were making a major bust today. You were right. You just busted yourself." Arthur turned on his heel and walked toward the glass doors, the sea of federal agents parting, to let him out into the sunlight. Chief of Police Thomas Henderson was on his second hole at the Bethesda Country Club when his encrypted duty phone began to vibrate violently. Henderson was a politician in a uniform, a man who had spent the last decade smoothing over minor scandals and keeping the affluent taxpayers happy. He expected this call to be about a noise ordinance or a minor traffic collision involving a city councilman's teenager. Instead, it was the mayor, screaming so loudly that Henderson had to pull the phone away from his ear. "Tommy, get your golf shoes off and get down to the precinct right now," Mayor David Campbell bellowed, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "Every news chopper on the East Coast is hovering over your station. The FBI just raided our police department. What in God's name is happening over there?" Henderson dropped his 9-iron on the pristine green grass. Mr. Mayor, slow down. The FBI? Did they serve a warrant? Was there a task force I wasn't briefed on? They didn't serve a warrant, Tommy. They served the wrath of God. One of your idiot patrolmen arrested the director of the FBI in his own driveway this morning, put him in cuffs, threw him in a cell. Get down there before the Department of Justice dissolves our entire city charter. The drive that usually took 20 minutes took Henderson 7. He ran every red light, the siren of his unmarked cruiser wailing a frantic, desperate tune. As he turned onto the street leading to the precinct, his stomach completely dropped. The mayor hadn't been exaggerating. The street was entirely barricaded by federal tactical vehicles. A perimeter of heavily armed SWAT operators stood shoulder to shoulder, aggressively holding back a rapidly swelling crowd of civilians and local news crews. 3 separate news helicopters circled like vultures overhead, capturing the unprecedented sight of a local American police station under federal siege. Henderson parked 2 blocks away and sprinted toward the perimeter, flashing his gold badge to the stone-faced federal agents. They barely parted to let him through, their eyes cold and unwelcoming. When Henderson pushed through the double-glass doors of his own station, the silence inside was deafening. The federal tactical sweep had finished, but the atmosphere was suffocating. Deputy Director Hayes was standing by the booking desk, speaking quietly into a satellite phone. Special Agent in Charge, Caldwell, was physically leaning over the booking counter, glaring down at Sergeant O'Malley, who looked as though he might physically vomit. "Who is in charge here?" Caldwell barked as Henderson walked in, out of breath and sweating through his polo shirt. "I am," Henderson said, his voice trembling, despite his best efforts to sound authoritative. "Chief Thomas Henderson, where is Director Pendleton? I need to personally apologize, and the director has left the premises," Hayes interrupted, snapping his phone shut and turning to face the chief. "He has no interest in your apologies, Chief Henderson. He is interested in accountability. And as of this moment, your department is under a sweeping federal microscope." Henderson looked around the room. Sitting on a plastic chair in the corner, stripped of his duty belt, badge and firearm, was Officer Derek Rollins. His head was buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking. Standing next to him, looking utterly defeated, was Officer Greg Miller. "What exactly happened?" Henderson demanded, staring directly at O'Malley. O'Malley couldn't even look his boss in the eye. Rollins grabbed a guy outside a mansion on Elmwood, said he fit the profile of a burglar, ignored the guy when he said he lived there, cuffed him, brought him in. "We didn't run the name until he was in the cage. He was watering his flowers," Hayes added softly, his voice dripping with venom. "Your man assaulted the chief law enforcement officer of the United States government because he didn't believe a black man could own a house in this zip code." Henderson felt his knees weaken. The liability, the lawsuits, the sheer, unimaginable public relations disaster. It was a career-ending meteor strike. He turned his fury toward Rollins. "Stand up!" Henderson roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "Stand up, Rollins!" Rollins slowly got to his feet, tears streaming down his face. "Chief, I swear he was acting suspicious. He wouldn't show me his ID. I was just following proactive patrol guidelines." "Shut your mouth!" Henderson screamed, pointing a trembling finger at the young officer. "You are stripped of all police powers immediately. You are suspended without pay, pending termination. And God help me, if the Union tries to fight this, I will personally burn this precinct to the ground." "The Union won't be an issue," Hayes stated coldly, stepping forward. He nodded to 2 towering FBI agents standing by the hallway. "Officer Derek Rollins, you are under arrest by the Federal Bureau of Investigation for violations of Title 18, United States Code, Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law. You are also being charged with federal kidnapping and battery of a federal official. Rollins gasped, stumbling backward until he hit the concrete wall. "No, no, wait! I'm a cop! You can't do this!" "You aren't a cop anymore, Derek," Caldwell said, stepping forward with a pair of heavy federal handcuffs. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." The irony was thick, suffocating, and absolute. In the exact same room where Rollins had strutted proudly just an hour before, boasting about his massive collar, he was now forcibly spun around. The federal agents locked the steel cuffs tightly around his wrists. "Chief, please, do something," Rollins begged, looking at Henderson. Henderson simply turned his back. "Process him," Caldwell ordered, "and put him in holding cell 2. I want him to sit on the exact same bench he forced the director to sit on." Rollins sobbed openly as the agents marched him down the familiar cinder-block hallway. The heavy metal bars of cell number 2 screeched open, and Rollins was shoved inside. The door slammed shut with a deafening finality. The key turned, the lock engaged. Rollins collapsed onto the cold metal bench, burying his face in his cuffed hands, the reality of his shattered life finally crushing him under its immense weight. 72 hours later, the Bethesda local precinct was utterly unrecognizable. The lobby had been converted into a makeshift federal command center. Desks were pushed together, covered in laptops, secure servers, and mountains of printed case files. The Department of Justice had dispatched a specialized civil rights investigative team, led by Senior Agent Sarah Jenkins. Jenkins was a methodical, terrifyingly brilliant investigator who specialized in dismantling corrupt police departments. She didn't yell. She didn't posture. She simply dug through paperwork until she found the rotting foundation. And in Bethesda, she didn't have to dig very deep. Arthur Pendleton's directive had been clear: audit every single arrest Derek Rollins had made over his 3-year career and review the supervisors who signed off on his reports. Agent Jenkins sat at the head of the precinct's conference room table, a thick manila folder resting under her folded hands. Sitting across from her was Officer Greg Miller, looking 10 years older than he had on Sunday. He had voluntarily surrendered his badge and was cooperating fully, desperate to secure an immunity deal and save his pension. "Officer Miller," Jenkins began, her voice crisp and professional, "we have spent the last 3 days reviewing Officer Rollins's arrest records. It seems he had an extraordinarily high rate of confiscating cash during his traffic stops and pedestrian checks." Miller swallowed hard, looking at the two-way mirror. Derek was aggressive. He targeted certain demographics. We all knew it. If a minority drove a nice car through the wrong neighborhood, Derek would pull them over for failing to signal. He'd claim he smelled marijuana to get probable cause for a search. And during these searches, Jenkins continued, opening the folder and sliding a photograph across the table, he frequently utilized civil asset forfeiture, claiming the cash he found was tied to illicit activities, even without a drug conviction. Miller nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am." He'd seized the money, told the suspects if they fought it, he'd hit them with felony distribution charges. Most people just walked away, happy not to go to jail. Jenkins leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Here is where the math stops working, Officer Miller. According to the property room logs, Rollins seized over $200,000 in cash over the last 3 years, but our forensic accountants have audited the precinct's forfeiture accounts. Only $40,000 was ever deposited." Miller's eyes widened in genuine shock. "Wait. What? Are you saying—" "I am saying," Jenkins corrected sharply, "that Derek Rollins wasn't just a racist, overzealous cop. He was a thief. He was using his badge to systematically extort innocent citizens, fabricating probable cause, stealing their money, and pocketing the difference." And Sergeant O'Malley was signing off on the heavily redacted property reports. The twist hit the precinct like a secondary explosion. The bad arrest of the FBI director wasn't just a catastrophic mistake. It had been an attempted robbery. Rollins had seen a black man at a $6 million estate and assumed he was either a criminal carrying illicit cash or a wealthy target who could be easily intimidated and shaken down. He had tried his usual extortion playbook on the absolute worst possible target on the planet. Down in the Federal Detention Center in Alexandria, Virginia, where Rollins had been transferred, the walls were rapidly closing in. Agent Jenkins walked into the bleak, windowless interview room, carrying a fresh stack of indictments. Rollins was wearing a bright orange federal jumpsuit, his face pale, dark circles bruising the skin under his eyes. He looked completely broken. "Agent Jenkins," Rollins croaked, his voice raw. "My lawyer said we might be able to work out a plea for the civil rights charge. I'll resign. I'll never work in law enforcement again. I just want to avoid federal prison." Jenkins didn't smile. She pulled out the chair and sat down, placing the thick stack of documents on the metal table. "Mr. Rollins, the civil rights charge regarding Director Pendleton is the least of your problems right now." Rollins frowned, confusion washing over his exhausted face. "What do you mean?" "We audited your forfeiture logs," Jenkins stated, her voice as cold as ice. "We found the offshore accounts you opened in the Cayman Islands. We found the $75,000 hidden in the drywall of your garage. We have sworn statements from 14 different victims who you illegally detained and robbed under the threat of fabricated felony charges." Rollins stopped breathing. The color drained from his face so fast, Jenkins thought he might pass out. "You thought you were untouchable because you hid behind a badge," Jenkins continued, leaning across the table to ensure he heard every single word. "You targeted marginalized people because you thought they didn't have the power to fight back. But then you got greedy. You got arrogant. You walked up a driveway in Elmwood Estates and tried to run your extortion game on Arthur Pendleton." "I didn't know," Rollins stammered, his mind short-circuiting as the sheer magnitude of his crimes was laid out before him. "I know you didn't," Jenkins said coldly, "and that is exactly why karma has caught up to you with such devastating precision. We are amending your charges, Mr. Rollins. You are no longer just facing a civil rights violation. We are charging you with 14 counts of extortion under color of official right, grand larceny, wire fraud, and federal racketeering." Rollins began to hyperventilate, his chest heaving as he gripped the edges of the metal table. "Racketeering? That's a RICO charge. That's for the mob. You operated a criminal enterprise using a police cruiser," Jenkins replied evenly, standing up and gathering her folders. "The maximum penalty for your combined charges is roughly 120 years in a federal penitentiary. The Department of Justice will not be offering you a plea deal. We are going to make a spectacular, national example out of you." Jenkins walked to the heavy steel door and knocked twice for the guard. She looked back over her shoulder at the ruined man sobbing violently into his orange sleeves. "Director Pendleton sends his regards," Jenkins said quietly. "He suggested I remind you to check your pension plan, because where you're going, you won't be needing it." The heavy door slammed shut, echoing down the bleak corridor of the federal prison. Derek Rollins was finally left alone in the dark, entirely consumed by the monstrous consequences of his own arrogance. 6 months later, the media circus surrounding the United States District Court in downtown Washington, D.C. was unlike anything the city had seen in a decade. News vans lined the streets for blocks, and reporters camped on the courthouse steps, eager to catch a glimpse of the man who had spectacularly dismantled his own life. The trial of former officer Derek Rollins had become a national spectacle, a glaring spotlight on the abuse of power and the swift, unforgiving hammer of federal justice. Inside the grand, oak-paneled courtroom, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Derek Rollins sat at the defense table, a hollow shell of the arrogant bully who had strutted up a Bethesda driveway 6 months prior. He was drowning in an ill-fitting grey suit, his face gaunt, his eyes darting nervously around the gallery. Beside him, his weary public defender shuffled papers, knowing there was absolutely no strategy that could save his client from the mountain of evidence the federal government had compiled. Lead prosecutor Evelyn Carter stood before the jury box, her voice ringing with clear, undeniable authority. She had spent the last 3 days methodically parading Rollins's past victims in front of the court. 14 different citizens, teachers, nurses, construction workers, had bravely taken the stand. They told chillingly similar stories of being pulled over, intimidated, threatened with fabricated drug charges, and robbed of their hard-earned cash by the man sworn to protect them. But the final nail in the coffin came when the prosecution called their star witness. A heavy silence fell over the gallery as Arthur Pendleton walked through the polished wooden doors. He was dressed in a pristine charcoal suit, his posture immaculate, radiating the quiet, absolute power of the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He did not look at Rollins as he walked to the witness stand, placed his hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. When Arthur sat down, Prosecutor Carter approached the podium. "Director Pendleton, could you please recount the events of that Sunday morning at your residence in Elmwood Estates?" Arthur spoke with clinical, devastating precision. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't show anger. He simply laid out the unvarnished facts. He described the lack of probable cause, the immediate resort to physical force, the refusal to verify identity, and the racial profiling that had driven the entire encounter. "Did the defendant ever ask for your name before placing you in handcuffs, Director?" Carter asked. "He did not," Arthur replied, his deep baritone echoing through the silent room. "He operated entirely on an assumption based on my race and my casual attire in an affluent neighborhood. He bypassed every procedural safeguard designed to protect the constitutional rights of the public." Rollins stared at the table, his face burning red, tears of profound shame and terror pooling in his eyes. "And when you arrived at the precinct, did anyone attempt to rectify the situation?" Carter pressed. Arthur's gaze slowly shifted to the gallery, where former Sergeant O'Malley was sitting. O'Malley had accepted a plea deal, agreeing to testify against Rollins in exchange for a reduced sentence of 5 years for accessory to extortion. The environment at the precinct was one of absolute complicity, Arthur stated firmly. The defendant operated with impunity because the system around him allowed it. It was a culture of arrogance that believed the badge was a shield against consequences. They were fundamentally incorrect. The defense did not even attempt to cross-examine the director. To question Arthur Pendleton on federal law or police procedure would have been procedural suicide. The jury deliberation took less than 3 hours. When the foreperson stood to read the verdict, Rollins gripped the edge of the defense table so tightly his knuckles turned white. "On the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law, we find the defendant guilty. On 14 counts of extortion, under color of official right, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of federal racketeering, we find the defendant guilty." The words struck Rollins like physical blows. He collapsed back into his chair, burying his face in his hands as quiet gasps rippled through the courtroom gallery. Judge Harold Mayweather, a stern man with zero tolerance for police corruption, looked down from the bench, his expression entirely unsympathetic. "Mr. Rollins," Judge Mayweather boomed, his voice dripping with disgust. "You were entrusted with the authority of the state. You were given a badge and a gun to protect the vulnerable. Instead, you used those tools to operate a criminal enterprise. You preyed upon the very citizens you swore to defend. Your actions are a cancer to the honorable profession of law enforcement." The judge picked up his gavel. You targeted the director of the FBI through sheer, prejudiced arrogance, and in doing so, you finally brought the light of justice to your dark extortion scheme. It is the judgment of this court that you be sentenced to 45 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole. You are remanded immediately to the custody of the United States Marshals. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Marshals immediately moved in, pulling a sobbing Derek Rollins to his feet, snapping heavy chains around his wrists and waist. As he was dragged toward the side door, Rollins looked over his shoulder one last time. Arthur Pendleton was standing quietly in the front row, his face completely impassive, watching the machinery of justice swallow the corrupt officer whole. A week later, Sunday morning returned to Bethesda, Maryland. The air was crisp, the sun rising over the manicured lawns of Elmwood Estates. Arthur Pendleton stood at the end of his long, paved driveway, wearing his faded Georgetown sweatshirt and old sneakers. He held the green garden hose, letting the water soak the soil of his prize-winning hydrangeas. The neighborhood was quiet, safe, and genuinely peaceful. A new local police cruiser drove slowly down the street. It pulled to a stop near the curb. Behind the wheel was a young, diverse officer from the newly reformed precinct. The officer rolled down the window, offering a respectful, professional wave. "Good morning, Mr. Pendleton," the officer called out warmly. "Beautiful day for the garden." Arthur smiled, a genuine, relaxed expression of peace. "Good morning, officer. It certainly is. Keep up the good work out there." The cruiser rolled away, leaving Arthur to the quiet comfort of his home. The system was broken in many places, but Arthur knew with absolute certainty that piece by piece he was fixing it. The storm had passed, and the bad apples had been uprooted. Karma had not just spoken, it had completely cleared the field. Derek Rollins thought a badge made him invincible, but he learned the hard way that true power lies in accountability and justice. He went fishing for an easy target and reeled in a 45-year federal prison sentence, losing everything he ever had. That is what happens when arrogance meets the immovable object of absolute karma. If you felt the satisfaction of seeing a corrupt bully finally face